Suffice it to say, the Louisiana Revolt of 1768, a very significant event, and this indicates what the reaction was among the French Creole population at the time to the new Spanish regime. What had happened is, after the 7 Years' War, Louisiana had become more of a liability than an asset, and it was given to Spain, and we can say that a lot of the people didn't like that because they were involved in all kinds of trade. The merchants were involved in illegal trade, smuggling commercial goods to French colonies in the Caribbean. So really, without exaggerating too much, we could say that the merchants in New Orleans or in Louisiana were part pirate, really, and they didn't like the fact that their lucrative trade deals were going to be interrupted by this transition because the Spanish were going to come in with new regulations. And as Daniel Esner mentioned, it was a frontier exchange economy. So all of the relations had developed organically over the past few generations. And they really couldn't stop people from behaving as they would without, at least not overnight. And as Shannon Lee Doughty has mentioned, we can call this rogue colonialism. So there's many things that were inspiring people to go rogue. There are economic reasons, there are also political reasons. And at the same time, in keeping with Dr. Esner's mention of what was happening with the indigenous and enslaved populations of African ancestry, they were fighting empire from within as well. So imperial forces were going against each other, but also within, there was a kind of a bubbling up of resistance to these colonial orders. In 1729, for example, Fort Rosalie was burned to the ground by the Natchez. The French took retribution and decimated the Natchez in turn. So even in this case, we may not know all the details of all these different rebellions and revolts. We actually happen to know about the revolt of 1768 because it was written down, and not all the pamphlets and other writings were destroyed by the Spanish authorities. Of course, you can imagine it was in their own interest to suppress that kind of knowledge and that kind of ferment. So they did do a translation of the manifesto, which I'll speak of in a moment, but a lot of the material had been destroyed. And so we can only imagine other things that had happened during this whole period. So after 3 decades, after the Natchez and the French were fighting, there was a resistance among the French Creole population of Louisiana against the new Spanish regime. They were outraged to discover that they had been given, along with the land, back to Spain. The new governor who came in, and that's just a quick visual on Spanish Louisiana. So you can see that the traces, this is actually during the time of the American Revolution, but in essence, you can see New Spain in the west, Spanish Louisiana, which up until recently had been French, and then on the East Coast, all the British colonies that then became the United States. So these 3 imperial forces fighting over kind of a Neapolitan-flavored colonial arrangement here, three flavors here. Well, Don Antonio de Ulloa y de la Torre Giral, to give him his proper title, had just become governor, and he basically was well-renowned throughout Europe as a brilliant scientist. He actually conducted his own experiments in magnetism and electricity, but unfortunately he just couldn't seize control after many years of delays. One of the issues was that he didn't have soldiers. So one of the ideas was that Governor Aubry of the French colonial regime, while he had some hundreds of soldiers, approximately 300. Now I know some of you have heard about the ancient 300 Spartans who fought with Leonidas at Thermopylae. Great, okay. Well, these guys are not, they're like anti-300, like negative 300, okay? Seriously, they wanted to drink, they wanted to go back home to France, they'd been here for too long, okay? So they weren't gonna be any help, okay? Okay, moving right along. So the other thing is that, as we just heard, it was very important to win over the Native Americans of the region. So some years later, in 1779, during the governorship of Galvez, you have all these items that need to be acquired and then given out as gifts to propitiate, to negotiate with all the different groups, of the indigenous groups. Some things we would expect, like guns and knives, but even like 500 pounds of glass beads, copper kettles. They were actually, like Ulloa was worried about like what color and shape some of these things were, like the other governors. So they knew that they had to do good. They had to do this right in order to secure good relations. So that's a very important point to think about with another real big delay in Ulloa taking over. So unfortunately, what happened was these French Creoles, they made Ulloa leave New Orleans in ignominy. The eloquent Lafreniere was the most prominent leader. arguing their legal cause. Others stirred up the Acadian and the German populations with promises of paying debts. Hundreds of armed men swarmed in the streets, rallying each other with cries of "Vive le bon vin de Bordeaux!" Long live the good wine of Bordeaux, right? And unfortunately, again, a lot of drinking was happening, so they drank a lot of the delicious wine. That was kind of an issue. They didn't anticipate Alejandro O'Reilly going full speed to New Orleans with these backup troops, the Spanish troops, so little did they know what was in store for him. The revolt was quickly suppressed. 6 men were condemned to death, while other leaders were given prison sentences. Joseph Villere, in fact, was the first person to die in the struggle. He died under mysterious circumstances, and in one account, he was actually bayoneted while he was resisting arrest. So that may have been what happened. And this actually right here, you can see a year later, these are the names of the leaders of the revolt. And at the bottom, you can see Villere, but spelled Villerey. Well, he was already dead, actually. So they tried him in absentia. So it wasn't enough to be dead. He's actually and then guilty too. So he's dead and then guilty. Pretty awful. Pretty harsh. Okay, so now there were economic reasons. There are also political reasons, and I don't want to downplay that. I think over time historians have argued over what was motivating this. Of course, it was a mixture of motives, and there were individuals like Pierre Marquis who probably had a hand in writing the manifesto. And this is a Spanish translation of the original French. And it's really fascinating because when you read through it, there are phrases like el derecho sagrado e inviolable, which is really like an echo of the sacred and inviolable right, which is like an echo of inalienable rights. So keep in mind, the American Revolution happens less than 10 years later. So some of these guys were thinking along those lines, okay? But before we go too far, they actually wanted to go back to France. So I kind of want to dub this the Declaration of Dependence. They want to depend, go back to the French crown, okay? So in any case, the revolt of 1768 still echoes through the history of the United States. And here in New Orleans, the street, I'm sure everyone who's from here, you know this, but people who are visiting, that street Frenchman, which is now the epicenter of live music in New Orleans, was named after these 6 men who were killed, and Joseph Villere was one of them. So it's a nice reminder. Whenever you see that street, you think about that. That's Joseph Villere. He's part of that. Okay. So without further ado, our next presentation, I introduce Jason Weiss, who will tell us all about the Battle of New Orleans.